If you were a German soldier on the Eastern Front and you heard the violent, rattling burst of a Ppsh-41 somewhere ahead of you, it usually meant one thing. The fight was about to get very close, very fast, and very ugly. This was not the kind of weapon that dominated a battlefield from hundreds of yards away. It didn't need to. The real danger of the Ppsh-41 began once Soviet troops got close enough to bring it into the kind of combat that defined so much of the war in the East. Inside shattered villages, frozen trenches, forests thick with smoke, and ruined city blocks where sightlines collapsed to a few seconds and a few yards. The Ppsh-41 became the sort of weapon German infantry learned to fear on instinct. And that fear was not just about the gun itself. It was about the kind of war it appeared in. On the Eastern Front, battles did not always unfold like the clean diagrams of pre-war planning. Entire offensives crashed into mud, snow, splintered woods, and cities reduced to rubble. Units got broken apart, formations lost cohesion. Attacks that began with artillery and maneuver often ended with men fighting across stairwells, courtyards, shell holes, and trench lines where the next target might appear almost without warning. In that kind of battlefield, the old strengths of a standard infantry rifle did not always matter as much as armies expected. For decades, the bolt-action rifle had been the backbone of infantry combat. It was accurate, dependable, and effective at range. In open ground with time to aim and space to engage, it could still do terrible work. But the Eastern Front constantly produced situations where range mattered less than speed, and where the man who could throw more bullets into a doorway, hallway, or trench corner in the first 2 seconds often won the fight outright. A soldier armed with a bolt-action rifle might fire a well-placed shot, work the bolt, reacquire the target, and fire again. But against a weapon designed to flood a tight space with automatic fire almost instantly, that rhythm could suddenly feel far too slow. That was especially true in Soviet combat doctrine as the war progressed. The Red Army learned through catastrophic losses that survival on the Eastern Front often depended on forcing the enemy into a kind of combat where hesitation became fatal. Soviet assault groups were expected to move hard, close distance, and break through positions with aggression, grenades, submachine guns, and overwhelming momentum. This was not warfare built around careful spacing and controlled long-range marksmanship alone. It was warfare that increasingly rewarded shock, speed, and concentrated violence at short range. The Ppsh-41 was a gun that matched the battlefield it served in almost perfectly. And once enough of them appeared in the same attack, German soldiers began to understand they were facing something very different from the armies they had expected to defeat in 1941. To understand why the Ppsh-41 became so feared, you first have to understand why the Soviet Union needed a weapon like it at all. The Soviet Union did not arrive at the Ppsh-41 from a position of comfort. It arrived there through disaster. When Germany invaded in June 1941, the Red Army suffered losses on a scale that was almost impossible to absorb. Entire formations were encircled and destroyed. Vast stockpiles of equipment were captured or abandoned. Hundreds of thousands of soldiers were killed, wounded, or taken prisoner in a matter of months. Under those conditions, the Soviet military did not just need weapons that worked. It needed weapons that could be built quickly, in enormous quantities, under the pressure of an industrial emergency. That requirement shaped almost every major wartime Soviet weapon, and the Ppsh-41 is one of the clearest examples of it. The Soviets already understood the value of submachine guns before the Ppsh appeared. They had experience with the earlier PPD series, and combat in places like the Winter War against Finland had shown that automatic fire at short range could be devastating under the right conditions. But the PPD was too expensive and too slow to manufacture on the scale the Soviet Union now required. It involved more machining, more time, and more industrial effort than a country fighting for survival could easily spare. What the Soviet Union needed was something far more practical. It needed a weapon that factories could turn out by the tens and then by the hundreds of thousands. It needed a design that relied heavily on stamped metal rather than finely machined parts, a gun that could be assembled faster and more cheaply, and one that would still function in the filthy, brutal conditions of the Eastern Front. Georgy Shpagin's design answered that need. The Ppsh-41 was not created to impress anyone with technical elegance. It was created to arm a massive wartime army with a weapon that was simple, rugged, and terrifyingly effective in the kind of combat Soviet troops increasingly found themselves fighting. That practicality was visible in nearly every aspect of the gun. It fired the 7.62 by 25 Tokarev cartridge, a high-velocity pistol round that gave it controllable automatic fire and strong penetration at short range. Its operating system was simple blowback, which kept production straightforward and reduced the number of complicated parts. The weapon's construction emphasized speed of manufacture, and Soviet factories relocated eastward under enormous strain could continue producing it even while much of the country was still fighting to avoid collapse. In wartime terms, that mattered just as much as raw battlefield performance. A weapon that was good in theory but slow to produce could not save an army that needed guns immediately. The PPSH also solved a deeper Soviet problem, one that went beyond industrial pressure. The Red Army needed firepower it could distribute widely among ordinary infantry. It was one thing to field a few specialist units equipped for close assault. It was another to place large numbers of automatic weapons into the hands of frontline soldiers across entire sectors of the front. Once production accelerated, the PPSH made that possible. Soviet infantry units that might otherwise have relied almost entirely on bolt-action rifles could now begin adding significant short-range automatic fire into assaults, urban fighting, reconnaissance actions, trench clearing, and defensive counterattacks. And that changed the feel of combat. German soldiers had entered the war expecting to fight an opponent that would be battered apart through superior training, initiative, and operational speed. In many of the opening campaigns, they had done exactly that. But as the war lengthened, the Red Army adapted. It rebuilt itself not as a mirror image of the Wehrmacht, but as a force increasingly shaped around the conditions it was actually facing. By itself, the PPSH-41 was just a submachine gun. What made it so feared was the way it collided with German battlefield reality. On paper, the Wehrmacht still had plenty of strengths at the infantry level. German soldiers were generally well-trained, their small unit leadership was often better than that of their opponents early in the war, and the standard Kar-98K rifle remained a reliable and accurate weapon. At medium and longer distances, that rifle could do exactly what it had been designed to do. But the Eastern Front had a habit of dragging men out of ideal conditions and forcing them into the kind of combat where the advantages of a bolt-action rifle began to collapse very quickly. The problem started with tempo. A Kar-98K rifleman could deliver accurate fire, but every shot required a cycle of motion. Fire, work the bolt, reacquire the target, fire again. Under controlled conditions, that rhythm was manageable. In a trench line, a forest edge, a village street, or the interior of a ruined building, it could become a serious handicap. The PPSH-41 did not ask its user to stop and rebuild his firing position after every round. The PPSH fired fast enough that its bursts sounded less like individual shots and more like a ripping metallic roar. German soldiers didn't just face a man with a gun. They faced a weapon that could instantly saturate a narrow space with bullets before a bolt-action rifleman had time to answer properly. And because so much combat on the Eastern Front happened in broken terrain, that first burst mattered enormously. In a city fight, the man who fired first at 10 yards usually didn't need textbook accuracy. He needed speed, volume, and the ability to overwhelm the other man before he could react. That was where the PPSH became especially dangerous. Soviet troops using it in assault groups could close in behind grenades, artillery, or suppressive rifle fire, and then unleash automatic bursts the moment they reached German positions. In trenches, dugouts, stairwells, courtyards, and factory floors, that kind of firepower had an effect that went beyond casualties. It disrupted thought. It made organized resistance harder. It forced men to keep their heads down or fire blindly, while Soviet attackers kept moving. German soldiers also understood that the PPSH often appeared in the hands of the kinds of troops most likely to use it aggressively. Soviet submachine gunners were not usually standing off at range trading careful shots. They were often the men coming forward in the most dangerous stage of the attack. The point where a battle stopped being a firefight in the abstract and turned into a brutal struggle for one room, one trench segment, one collapsed street. Once those troops got close enough, the PPSH could make a German position feel as if it were being swallowed by automatic fire from multiple directions at once. There was also a psychological dimension to it that should not be underestimated. Infantrymen learn weapons partly through what they do, and partly through what they sound like when they are suddenly turned against you. The Ppsh had a sound German veterans remembered because it often meant the battle had moved into the range where reaction time vanished. It did not need to be perfect. It only needed to be there first, and in the East, it very often was. If there was one battlefield that seemed almost designed to reveal exactly what the Ppsh-41 could do, it was Stalingrad. This was not a campaign dominated by sweeping maneuver. Once the fighting reached the city itself, it became a war of collapsed distance. Entire sections of the battlefield were reduced to factories, apartment blocks, rail yards, warehouses, stairwells, basements, and shell-shattered streets where visibility could disappear in an instant. A man might have open ground in front of him one moment and be fighting across a single room the next. In that kind of environment, the normal balance between rifles, machine guns, grenades, and automatic weapons changed dramatically. German infantry had entered the Soviet Union with confidence in the methods that had carried them across Poland, France, and much of the opening Eastern campaign. Those methods depended heavily on coordination, discipline, and the ability to bring rifle and machine gun fire to bear in a structured way. Stalingrad stripped much of that structure away. Rubble blocked sight lines. Walls turned every movement into an ambush risk. Artillery created new paths through buildings while cutting off old ones. Positions were stacked above and below each other, so a fight could break out from rooftops, upper floors, courtyards, or sewer entrances with almost no warning. The city broke battles into fragments, and once combat fragmented, the value of a weapon that could dominate a few yards of space in seconds went up enormously. That was exactly the sort of fight the Ppsh-41 could thrive in. Soviet troops defending or counterattacking inside the city often organized themselves into small assault groups built for close combat. They moved through walls, across debris, and around unexpected angles where a rifle's range advantage meant very little. In those conditions, the question was not who could hit a target at 300 yards. The question was who could flood a corridor, workshop, or staircase with fire before the other side had time to recover. A Ppsh in the hands of a determined soldier could do that with frightening speed. It allowed Soviet troops to hit hard during the first critical moments of contact, when confusion was highest and survival often depended on violence delivered immediately. German veterans described Stalingrad as a place where the front line barely existed in any normal sense. Men fought for single rooms, then for opposite ends of the same room. A machine gun might still dominate a street or a courtyard, but once troops got inside the ruins, the battle often belonged to grenades, submachine guns, pistols, entrenching tools, and sheer aggression. The Ppsh fit that world far better than a traditional long rifle. Its drum magazine gave Soviet troops the ability to sustain bursts through the exact kind of brief, savage encounters that defined urban fighting. A German soldier with a Kar 98K still had a deadly weapon in his hands, but in a collapsed factory hall or a half-destroyed apartment corridor, he was being asked to use a precision tool in a fight that had become brutally compressed. And Stalingrad was not unique because it was the only place where this happened. It was unique because it revealed the pattern so clearly. The same logic applied in countless villages, trench systems, and fortified positions across the Eastern Front. Whenever combat narrowed down to short lines of sight and sudden movement, the Ppsh became disproportionately dangerous. Forest fighting could produce the same effect. So could night attacks, surprise infiltrations, and assaults against dug-in positions where the final approach brought both sides into almost immediate contact. What Stalingrad did was compress all of those conditions into one of the most infamous battles of the war and force both armies to adapt inside a battlefield that punished hesitation relentlessly. For German soldiers, that meant learning that Soviet infantry armed with Ppsh-41s were not just another variation of the enemy they had met in 1941. They were part of a Red Army that had absorbed catastrophe, changed under pressure, and become increasingly dangerous in exactly the kind of fighting that decided cities and strong points. By the time the battle for Stalingrad had burned itself into military history, the reputation of the Ppsh-41 was no longer tied only to its design or its rate of fire. It had become tied to a kind of close-range Soviet warfare that German troops could hear before they fully saw it, and often had only seconds to survive once it arrived. Of course, none of this meant the Ppsh-41 was some flawless wonder weapon, because it wasn't. Like every firearm of the war, it had clear limits, and those limits became obvious the moment the fight moved out of the kind of close, violent spaces where it was most effective. At longer ranges, German riflemen still had the advantage. The KAR-98K could reach farther, hit harder at distance, and in open terrain, it remained the more practical weapon for deliberate aimed fire. The PPSH, by contrast, was never meant to win that kind of contest. Its cartridge simply did not offer the same long-range performance as a full-power rifle round, and when the battlefield opened up, its greatest strengths began to matter less. It could also burn through ammunition very quickly, especially in the hands of frightened or inexperienced soldiers firing long bursts. And while the drum magazine gave the weapon much of its famous image, it also added weight and could be awkward in real field conditions. German soldiers did not come to fear it because it outperformed every other weapon in every situation. They feared it because war on the Eastern Front so often collapsed into the exact kind of fighting where the PPSH felt brutally effective and frighteningly well-suited. In those moments, its weaknesses stopped mattering as much. A lack of long-range precision meant very little in a stairwell, a trench line, a cellar, a shattered workshop, or a village street where the enemy was suddenly only a few yards away. What mattered there was speed, volume of fire, and the ability to seize control of those first few seconds before the other side could recover. That was where the PPSH earned its name, and that was where German infantry learned to hate it.